Die Eule der Minerva beginnt erst mit Dämmerung ihren Flug. Also, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, willkommen zur Samstagnacht mit Hegel. So apologies for my German pronunciation, but I just wanted to do a little something on this wonderful Samstagnacht. It's not quite dusk, but close to it. So basically, I've been looking at some shorter and simpler texts that we are supposed to have covered. And one of them is the introduction to Hegel from Cahn, an introduction which is written by a fairly well-known scholar, Stephen Smith. Many of you may know Smith as the author of, I would say, wonderful video course of Open Yale courses, Introduction to Political Philosophy. Unfortunately, this course is far too basic for us to use for preparation for University of London exams, and I should warn everybody against actually watching Stephen Smith's course, again, partly because it's basic and partly because some of his interpretations I feel are fairly different from the interpretations of the University of London, such that I don't think it's really worth our time. But in general, I do hold Professor Smith in very high esteem, and I would definitely recommend Professor Smith to anybody who's starting to do political philosophy. But this is not you and me, because second-year students, you understand, far more advanced knowledge is required from us on the exam. Anyway, so I've been looking through this text. So, like, is it part of the official home assignment? Well, I suppose yes, because Stephen Cahn, he's the official textbook for the course, and this is where our excerpts come from. So I think it's natural for the University of London to sort of expect us to have looked at least at the introductions to the text. The texts themselves by Hegel, I think, are also valuable. The text of Philosophy of Right is fairly difficult reading. The text of Philosophy of History is much simpler, although I'm not sure how useful it is. So, like, at the end of the day, I think we did right. We did well to concentrate on certain specific secondary texts, secondary sources, but I do also want to get to primary sources at some point. So, but this is not the plan for tonight. The plan for tonight is to read this introduction. So let me just open the introduction and go just word for word. So I think it's useful both to the advanced students, something can find there, and students who are revising the basics. So anyway, let me just read this. So Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel was born into a middle-class family in Stuttgart. He attended a university at Tübingen, where he was a classmate of the philosopher Schelling and the poet Hölderlin. So it's an interesting connection, although no time to pursue it within the limits of this course. But Schelling and Hölderlin actually were roommates of Hegel. So all sorts of interesting stories related to that. Anyway, legend has it they celebrated together news of the outbreak of the French Revolution. Look at this. Celebrated the outbreak of the French Revolution. So for all of Hegel's, elements of critical attitude towards the French Revolution, all of his conservatism, still, especially as a young man, he celebrated the French Revolution as bringing liberty, equality, fraternity throughout the world. And I should go back to the text, but let me just say this. I think, to some extent, this is a good way to see Hegel as somebody who, as a young man, was committed to the ideals of the French Revolution, and who was disappointed that those ideals did not actually materialize in real life. And it's not, my reading of Hegel is not as an anti-liberal. I think he wants to secure individual freedom, but he understands that freedom has conditions, but he is deeply committed to freedom. And so whenever he talks about all these things, which other people regard as totalitarian or state worship, this is nothing more than for Hegel simply focusing on the essential conditions which secure something which he truly valued, which is not the state, not this periodic stuff, but freedom, at least on my reading, which is, of course, controversial. Anyway, so Hegel held the post of lecturer at the University of Vienna, where he finished his first major book, The Phenomenology of Spirit, which fortunately or unfortunately we're not reading in this course, in 1807. It was here that he saw Napoleon, this world soul on horseback. So the manifestation of Weltgeist on horseback, Napoleon, right? Right through the town. Why, by the way, Napoleon is the manifestation of the world spirit? Because Napoleon is the bringer of liberty, equality, fraternity, the ideals of the French Revolution throughout Europe, and especially to Germany. Anyway, due to the closing of the university, Hegel found employment first as a newspaper editor at Bamberg and later as the headmaster of Gymnasium at Nuremberg. During these years, he began working on his science of logic and was subsequently called to a professorship, first at Heidelberg and then at Berlin, where he succeeded Fichte to a chair of philosophy. His major work of political philosophy, philosophy of right, Rechtsphilosophie, was published in 1821. He died in 1839 in the midst of a typhus epidemic. I will refrain from making a comment on that in light of the recent events. Philosophy of right excited controversy almost immediately upon publication. Now, this is important, okay? This is something every student should mention when they write about Hegel. So philosophy of right excited controversy almost immediately upon publication, in part because of the prefatory statement, was vernünftig ist, das ist wirklich, und was wirklich ist, das ist vernünftig. What is rational is actual, what is actual is rational. Notice the difference of translation. I say real, the text here says actual. What is really important is that nicht alles, was existiert, ist wirklich. So not everything that exists is actual. The German word is wirklich. So something that Alan Wood points out on many occasions, so that in some sense, the idea for Hegel is something more, maybe more real than what you actually see outside the window. Again, like when Hegel writes his philosophy of right, when he extols the virtue of the Prussian state, he extols the virtues not of the actually existing Prussian state. Apologies for repeating the word actual in a different meaning, the kind that he sees outside the window, but what he sees as the essential nature of the idea of the state, which is, in some quasi-Platonic fashion, is maybe less visible outside the window, but actually more real to the eye of the philosopher. Anyway, so this statement, what is actual, what is rational is actual, what is actual is rational, was vernünftig ist, das ist wirklich, right? Critics took to be a wholesale justification of the political status quo. So this was originally always regarded as a defense of some sort of a extremely conservative worldview, right? That sort of the state as it already exists is perfection, and if you don't like it, it's your problem. Again, controversial reading. Later in the century, it came to be regarded as a rearguard defense of the Prussian state. So rearguard meaning conservative defense of the Prussian state. And during World War I, it was thought to provide a defense for German militarism and imperialism. During the Cold War, Hegelianism was associated with both the rise of German National Socialism and Soviet communism, although Marxist defenders of Hegel regarded his dialectic as inherently progressive and liberating. Recently, philosophy of right has been reassessed as a classic work of reformist or gradualist liberalism, in keeping with other great 19th century works by liberals like Benjamin Constant, Alexis de Tocqueville, and John Stuart Mill. Wonderful phrase, I think, from Stephen Smith. Let's underline this. So this is something, again, for you to take into your essays. Again, this notion that Hegel can be seen as a reactionary, or used to be seen as a reactionary, but recently, it has been reassessed as a, notice, class, as a reformist or gradualist liberal. Reformist or gradualist liberal, in keeping with other great 19th century works by liberals such as Benjamin Constant, Alexis de Tocqueville, and John Stuart Mill. Difficulties with philosophy of right often begin with the very title of the book. The subject. Now, this is a problem we do not have in Russian. We understand prava, philosophy of prava. This Russian word prava has these connotations. The English word right doesn't really. So let's look at this explanation for English speakers. The subject matter of the book is stated in the introduction as the idea of right. The German word for right, Recht, is ambiguous. It can mean either law in the relatively narrow sense of jurisprudence, or right in the broader sense of proper ordering of political relationships. So exactly like the Russian word prava could mean юридическое право, юриспруденция, or it could mean право as in право дело, something what is right to do. The subtitle of the work, Natural Right and Political Science in Outline, indicates Hegel's preference for this wider meaning of the term. So wider meaning of the term. Prava as recht as something which is right to do, if you want. The idea of right refers to more than the structure of civil rights and liberties, but to the entire normative dimension of a people's way of life, their ethical norms and values, including their system of public morality and religion. The opening paragraphs of Philosophy of Right provide an account of the source or ground of right in a theory of human will. So the source or ground of right in a theory of human will. So when we say human will, probably we mean something like individual human will, right? Anyway, like the entire modern tradition of moral and political philosophy, as developed by the likes of Hobbes and Kant, Hegel believes that the will is the ultimate source of political legitimacy. So, like Hobbes and Kant, Hegel believes that the will is the ultimate source of political legitimacy. Apologies, my scan is not very clean, but I did not want to waste time on making a proper scan since you all have the book. Anyway, Hegel treats the will as consisting of three aspects or moments. So Hegel treats the will as consisting of three aspects or moments. The first is defined by the will's ability to abstract freely from all content, from everything empirical or merely given in experience. This kind of freedom is associated with the element of pure indeterminacy, the will's ability to choose anything and everything. This moment of sheer negativity is deeply resistant to any form of limitation. As such, it is entirely empty. Okay, so this is an important phrase in all sorts of ways. Important, also not very clear. So let me immediately stress, we are right now on a quest to understand better what Hegel means by abstract right. And I feel that abstract right and abstract freedom, or this pure indeterminacy, are actually two different things and should not be confused. Okay, let me repeat that. I think that abstract right and this pure indeterminacy have nothing in common. These are different things. Let's not confuse them. This first moment is fairly, I think, fairly clear, should be fairly clear to us. Again, this notion that freedom has a negative dimension, has a negative moment or a negative condition. In order to be free, you should be free to choose. Free to choose, again, pure on this basis of pure indeterminacy, to choose whatever, absolutely whatever. But as such, this moment of pure choice is entirely empty. You are not choosing anything. You do not have any reasons to choose one thing or another. So let's imagine I'm choosing what to have for dinner. On the level of pure indeterminacy, I cannot make a choice, because to choose on the basis of health benefits, or to choose on the basis of my taste, or calorie intake, that's already to choose on the basis of something. On the level of pure indeterminacy, there is no basis of choice. So in some sense, no choice can be made. So this is a necessary but not a sufficient condition of freedom. I hope that this is clear. We have talked about this a lot of times. Anyway, the first moment of the will's activity leads dialectically to the second. Let's just imagine the word dialectical is not there. I'm not sure if it clarifies much for our purposes. Anyway, freedom of the will does not mean arbitrary choice. To will means to choose something determinate, the decision to be this rather than that. To will is not merely to declare one's independence from all content, it is to be something specific. The need for will to be something concrete or specific is not a constraint of freedom, but is essential to it. Again, when I choose what to have for dinner, my grounds of choice indeed limit what I could have for dinner. But on the one hand, seemingly or apparently limit, but actually they don't limit. They make my choice meaningful, because to stay on this level of abstract indeterminacy is to make no choice at all. Or if you want, I could, like Buridan's ass, Buridana Fasol, make a completely arbitrary choice, but a completely arbitrary choice, произвольный выбор, is not freedom. To be free is to be determined by the right kinds of causes, by rational causes, if you want. So furthermore, willing is not an arbitrary choice, but an act of rational deliberation. So long as we understand the will to mean arbitrary choice, it is not truly free. This is a childish, immature understanding of freedom. Just, I am free because I've chosen to do this rather than that. That's not a good reason. Like I'm choosing this to have this for dinner simply because I want to choose this for dinner. This is not real freedom. Real freedom is again a rational decision. You know, I'm having something which is good for me, which is tasty, which is nutritious. I'm giving reasons, not just because I want to, not just das ist mein Wille, right? Anyway, uh, um, yeah. So long as we understand the will to mean arbitrary choice, it's not truly free. The freedom identified with arbitrary choice, Willkür, German, is associated by Hegel with slavery to natural appetites and passions. We have seen this before in Rousseau, for example. Slavery to natural appetites and passions. And this is a great difference between Rousseau and Hegel on the one hand and Hobbes on the other. The self-determination of the rational will, by contrast, is characterized not just by a capacity for choice, but for reflection and deliberation over the ends we choose. Rational liberty consists in the ability to reflect evaluatively upon the kinds of things we ought to desire, including the kinds of persons we ought to become. So again, it's not exactly like Hobbes. Whatsoever is the object of any man's appetite or desire, but there are things that we rationally ought to desire for Hegel, and there are the kinds of ideals we ought to strive towards. Rushing ahead, these ideals are given by the logic of by a higher rationality embedded in the logic of history and crystallized in the norms and customs of our particular community. One second. Yeah. The final aspect. The final aspect of the will's activity consists in determining what kind of content is appropriate to freedom. To what ought the free will give its consent? Despite his often fierce rejection of the social contract theory, there is built into Hegel's theory of will an idea of rational consent as the only plausible justification for modern political institutions. This is important, so let me underline this. So again, the idea an idea of rational consent as the only plausible justification for modern political institutions. Look at this. So free consent of an individual's will is an essential element of political legitimacy, in other words. So this is against all of those people, like Bertrand Russell, Karl Popper, who misread Hegel as a totalitarian. The person largely credited for recognizing this principle is Rousseau, so credited by Hegel. So Hegel sees this principle in Rousseau, who is congratulated for adducing the will as the principle of the state. The aim of making the rational will the ultimate arbiter of the state is to make citizens feel at home in the world, to overcome the various forms of division. Zerrissenheit, I think, that have previously alienated citizens from their public institutions. The major headings of the philosophy of right are thus given over to an account of the kinds of public institutions that the free will can ratify or affirm as its own. So institutions that free will can ratify or affirm. Notice, not create, that's impossible, but to affirm or ratify something that already exists. The whole domain of these institutions and practices constitutes the sphere of right. Before indicating briefly how these institutions satisfy the conditions of rational freedom, Hegel's views must be distinguished from two positions which he is frequently identified with. So, interesting. Something for the University of London essay. So, two positions which are often attributed to Hegel, but Stephen Smith says are wrongly attributed to Hegel. The first position, so this is going to be our first position, and then the second position. So the first maintains that Hegel has no independent theory of moral justification because he ultimately subordinates the rights of individual judgment and conscience to the will of the state. We have seen something like this in Alan Paton. So Alan Paton also discusses this. This is the conventionalist reading of Hegel. This is the conventionalist reading of Hegel. Let me add this now. Conventionalist. So in Paton. So conventionalist in the sense that there's no judge independent of the community. So whatever the community says has to be right. And that is wrong, according to Stephen Smith. Yeah, so because he ultimately subordinates the rights of individual judgment and conscience to the will of the state. So the first maintains that Hegel has no independent theory of moral justification because he ultimately subordinates the rights of individual judgment and conscience to the will of the state. To be sure, there are more than enough passages in the work affirming such sentiments. For example, the state in and by itself is the ethical whole. Or you remember from Klosko this notion that the state is the march of God on earth. Hegel frequently criticizes the standpoint of Kantian morality, as an empty formalism for its attempt to generate a universal principle of right action. Notice this paragraph 135 is actually in our reading here in Cahn, so probably a good idea to look at that more closely. As Hegel sometimes writes, there is no principle of right over and above the state. He enjoys recalling the ancient story of a man who asked a philosopher the best way of educating his son. The philosopher replied, make him a citizen of a state with good laws. Paragraph 153, again, something maybe for us to look at. A second criticism, so this is the conventionalist reading. And notice, here and now, Stephen Smith does not reject, does not rebuke, does not refute this reading. He just says, this is a frequent misreading. This is first misreading. The second misreading. Second criticism turns on Hegel's frequently noted historicism. On this account, Hegel subordinates the moral will to the forward or progressive march of history. Every individual, he notes in the preface to the Philosophy of Right, is a child of his time. So Hegel says, every individual is the child of his time. Morality is thus made relative to time, place, and circumstance. History is advanced precisely by great leaders like Caesar and Napoleon, who served the cause of moral progress, but at the expense of much misery and human suffering, which is supposedly then justified by this progress. In the introduction to the philosophy of history, Philosophie der Weltgeschichte, Hegel presents these world historical individuals as moral heroes whose greatness consists in embodying the dominant ethos or spirit of the times. Again, we should take a look at the introduction to the philosophy of world history, but we should take a look very carefully because it's very easy to simply fish out a certain bunch of totalitarian sounding quotes and just pile them on as accusations against Hegel, and that's not a very good sound strategy in terms of our exam, I'm afraid. So we should read this text with care. It's very easy to misread this text. This text has something of a careless quality, I think. Like maybe Hegel, when he's speaking in this text, he's being a little bit rash or is cutting corners. Anyway. Well, historical men, Hegel writes, the heroes of an epoch must therefore be recognized as its clear-sighted ones. Their deeds, their words are the best of that time. However, even the most far-sighted of heroes play a limited role as the agents or instruments of a historical process they cannot in principle comprehend. This is the famous cunning of reason, List der Vernunft. Once they achieve their ends, they are fated to fade from the scene. When their object is attained, Hegel hints darkly, they fall off like empty hulls from the kernel. Let's continue. So Hegel's answer to these objections. So two objections, now the answer. Hegel's answer to these objections can be found in his concept of Sittlichkeit, or ethical life, that comprises the entire third part of philosophy of right. The German word for ethics, Sitte, emphasizes the role of practice, custom, and habituation in forming moral judgment and character. In contrast to Kant's view of morality, Hegel stresses that moral reasoning is not something that applies to individuals in the abstract, but takes place within the context of tradition, a community of moral reasoners. Hegel's use of the term is intended to evoke the place of habituation and practice in the moral life. He enjoys tweaking the modern moral standpoint by evoking a largely unreflective and habitual character of ethical life. His conception of fully developed moral virtue takes the form of rectitude, which involves little more than obeying the laws and fulfilling the duties of one station. So, morality or ethical life, ethics in this case, is something unreflective, something that simply has been absorbed by individuals. through their education, something which is, well, interesting, controversial on the one hand, but on the other hand, Hegel would say highly realistic, because most people do not spend hours deliberating before they make moral decisions. Usually, moral convictions sort of take over individuals' actions. And where do these moral convictions come from? They come from the society in which individuals live in. Anyway, many interpreters have seen in Hegel's conception of social ethics an incipient relativism according to which standards of right and wrong can come only from within existing conventions and institutions. His identification of Sittlichkeit with absolutely valid laws and institutions appears to give it a conservative dimension reminiscent of Burkean traditionalism. But this is to misidentify Hegel's conception of Sittlichkeit. Ethical life is not just a descriptive sociological term, but a term of moral classification and evaluation. It is not just a description of what institutions happen to exist. It is a rational account of what institutions must exist if rational freedom is to be possible. So this is the answer. This is the answer that Stephen Smith deploys in defense of Hegel. That Hegel is not simply a conventionalist or a historicist. No, that Hegel offers a rational reconstruction, that the institutions which the idea of the Prussian state embodies are the ones which are actually, if you want, logically or rationally necessary for freedom to be possible, for real freedom to be possible. Institutions and practices are not called upon to be judges in their own case. Rather, institutions and practices are themselves judged by their capacity to further and sustain human desire for freedom. So again, this is in response to the claims of Hegel as a totalitarian. Philosophy of right is nothing less than an articulation of those institutions of modern ethical life that most completely correspond to the moral imperative of freedom. These institutions, the famous Hegelian triad of family, civil society, and the state. By civil society, again, bürgerliche Gesellschaft, I remind you that Hegel is talking about something like the market, mostly the market, not only, but mostly the market. Like if you just oversimplify in your head that civil society is the market, you will not make a huge mistake. Are judged by how well they promote mutual recognition or respect between citizens. So these institutions, family, civil society, and the state, are judged by how well they promote mutual recognition or respect between citizens. Hegel's conception of Sittlichkeit does not celebrate existing standards, whatever they may happen to be, but is tied to a distinctive conception of human agency and moral personality. A quote from Hegel: "Be a person and respect others as persons," is Hegel's watchword. Being a person means having a sense of oneself as an autonomous agent, with a will and a consciousness of one's own. So individuality, the subjective condition of freedom. Hegel reminds us that the attainment of personality is not just an individual, but a social and even a historical accomplishment. Again, this idea that individuality emerges historically, that the modern individuality was impossible, for example, in ancient Greece. This the full scope of subjective condition of freedom, if you want. Hegel's defense of the moral legitimacy of social institutions obviously makes sense only against the background of his general conception of philosophy. The aim of philosophy, he remarks in the preface to Philosophy of Right, is not to construct a Platonic utopia, but to discover the rationality in what exists. So this is, I think, this is the crux of the matter. This is kind of the problem, because on the one hand, Hegel seems to sit in the high court of philosophy above the existing institutions. So philosophy is going to judge existing institutions as to how well they can further and sustain the human desire for freedom. But at the same time, the way that Hegel does this is by sort of offering an interpretation of already existing institutions as already rational. So there's this kind of, I would say, something of an internal tension between these two things that Hegel tries to do at the same time. Again, to try to judge the existing institutions standing above them, and at the same time, by entering within them to show their rationality, seemingly without judging them. But at the same time, well, Stephen Smith is going to say, no, Hegel has done his philosophical homework. He has sat in the high court of philosophy in order to pass judgment. in order to declare that we have already arrived, at least on the level of the idea, at the end of history. He knows and understands and sees, at least in the idea of the Rechtsstaat, the end of history, and can rationally demonstrate that this is really the end of history, at least on the level of the idea. Anyway, philosophy, he avers, wonderful word. So avers, asserts, alleges. Philosophy, he avers, cannot give advice about what ought to be the case, but should seek to reconcile citizens to the world they actually inhabit. Wonderful. Contradiction within the same sentence. Well, let's not use the word contradiction. Let's use the word contradiction dialectically. This is a productive internal tension. This is not a counsel of despair. For Hegel, the world we now inhabit is so arranged that we see ourselves perfectly expressed within the institutions of modern Sittlichkeit. So again, I keep talking about this internal tension. Reflect this in your work. Make this reflection sing in your University of London exam. Anyway, but still, let's reread the last sentence. For Hegel, the world that we now inhabit is so arranged that we see ourselves perfectly, notice, perfectly expressed within the institutions of modern Sittlichkeit. Freedom need no longer be sought in an ideal world that perpetually eludes our grasp, but in the forms of social and political life now before us already. For some, this strategy will seem far too accommodationist to prove satisfactory. So less Hegelians, and especially Marx. However, to reverse Marx's famous dictum, the purpose of philosophy is not to change the world, but to interpret it. Okay, I'm sure there's more to be said, but I kind of wanted to keep this recording short. So let me pause here. I hope this was somewhat useful. Thank you very much for your attention. And liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, I will see you next time.